I think we'll just begin with Tony Cascardi and then proceed in alphabetical order, okay?
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Celeste. Thank you, Lisbet, for your very fascinating, provocative, challenging words yesterday. I'm happy to lead what I hope would be a chorus of support for the strong and indeed impassioned case that Lisbet has made for open access. The refrain is loud and clear. Knowledge is a public good, not a private possession. Especially when the production of knowledge is funded by public resources, it's altogether right for it to be placed in a public trust, not held behind the gates of some guarded community. As a scholar, I have every interest in seeing the free and unfettered circulation of the works I write. I think of how many of those 150 million hits on JSTOR were just looking for something I might have written. Nor can I imagine that any one of my colleagues would wish to limit the circulation of their work if that's what our current system of publishing and copyright in fact does. The goals, as I see them, ought to be securing the integrity of content, the appropriateness of attribution, and the accurate tracking of contributions made during the scholarly process. If open access can afford these things, which in the right circumstances I believe it can, then we stand a chance of achieving the goal of returning knowledge to the community while also engaging broad communities of scholars, including citizen scholars, in the production of knowledge. The question is, how will we move to open access? I think we need to do three things beyond urging the moral rightness of scholarship as a public good. First, I think we need to create a desire for it, which I envision as a mechanism of a pull rather than a push. Second, because open access is not cost-free, we need to create sustainable business models for it, and moreover, business models with the right balance of incentives rather than the somewhat perverse incentives enforced today. And third, we need to think far more imaginatively about the ways in which open access can unleash the power of the copy in the digital age, exposing new opportunities that are equally creative and responsible. So about the first of these three things, I think I can do best by offering a sort of analogy. The analogy I propose is to the sea change that we've experienced when it comes to sustainable green alternatives to conventional products. It took a sense of responsibility to help bring the shift about, but it took more than that. It took the creation of a set of desires to be green and sustainable, along with the development of a corresponding set of along with a corresponding set of aversions to the polluting alternatives. It also took business models in which the costs of locally and sustainably produced products could be driven down and their market value driven up. Open access is, of course, a horse of a different color. I don't really like that figure, but that's what I ended up with in the space of a day. It's a horse of a different color, so to speak. But that's quixotic, yes. But there is the need, similarly, to create a desire for it if whatever business models we might invent for it are to have a chance of succeeding. Among other things, we need the intellectual leaders to begin saying that they will publish only on open access platforms. We need to get the hottest, most in-demand scholars on board with this project if we're even to get the process going. Academia feeds equally on the energies of a fiercely critical independence and on an astounding degree of herd mentality. We need to redirect the instinct of the herd if open access is to succeed. Beyond the principles that Lisbet Rausing articulated so well, we also need to develop the possibilities for new kinds of research that open access can afford, recognizing that without it, the growth of knowledge in the digital age is bound to be stunted. Our copyright laws have kept the power of the copy from being fully realized. In the arena of scholarly publishing, it's the content that needs protection, insofar as it needs protection at all, not the sanctity of an original artifact. Indeed, it's not even clear what an original artifactual piece of scholarly writing would be considered nowadays. I ask myself what in the things I have written or my colleagues have written would be considered the artifact. It's something more like the content. Protection doesn't need to involve limiting access, but it does involve assurance of integrity. Anything we then can do to multiply the circulation of the content while assuring its integrity and proper attribution ought to be encouraged. The more we can return knowledge production to the widest community, the better. And the more that community at large can contribute to its production and circulation, the better still. Now, what we think of as circulation in the digital world has a direct bearing on the usefulness of information. The principal factors, I think, are threefold. Two are defined by the most basic features of information in the internet age, the link and the tag. The third is defined by a new set of relationships between the producers and the consumers of knowledge. Together, these are helping to reshape the distinction between knowledge and information. Think of knowledge as information that has a meaning, hence a value. Without meaning, information of any kind may well be undigestible and useless. As one New York Times writer put it, thinking explicitly of the new Alexandria that is at least a theoretical possibility given the enormous book scanning projects now underway, I quote, "Turning inked letters into electronic dots that can be read on a screen is simply the first essential step in creating the new library. The real magic will come in the second act, as each word in each book is cross-linked, clustered, cited, extracted, indexed, analyzed, annotated, remixed, reassembled, and woven deeper into the culture than ever before. In the new world of books, every bit informs another. Every page reads all the other pages." And there is a kind of Borgesian resonance to that phrase. In this context, you can think of the link as providing the syntactical element and the tag as providing the semantic component of whatever may go to constitute knowledge. The link is the essential connecting piece, but shorn of content, it's of relatively limited value. That's where the tag comes in. The tag, citing the same Times writer, is something like a public annotation, like a keyword or category name that is hung on a file, a page, or a picture or song, enabling anyone to search for that file. Some have in fact predicted that because tags are principally user-generated, when they move into the realm of books, they'll be assigned faster, range wider, and serve better than out-of-date schemes like the Dewey Decimal System, particularly in frontier or fringe areas like body modification or nanotechnology. If we think of a wide web of links without tags, we get nonsense, just as having tags without the connecting links is a bit like having a very long list of vocabulary words without sentence structures. When we, or at least I, think of the intelligent tools that might be applied to open access materials, I think of ones that afford the greatest possibility of establishing valuable structures built out of links and tags, and of course doing so in ways that maximize the access to the information with which they work. The point is that both of these are essential, the links and the tags, syntax and semantics. When we think of knowledge as information that has meaning and in turn value, then it's clear that we have to manage the coordination of these two with equal care. Manage doesn't mean control, but it does mean guide, shape, curate, archive, cull, and in some ways do all the things that we're used to doing, but necessarily do them in new ways, I think, to resonate with the point that Lisbet was making yesterday. We know from everything ranging from Flickr to Wikipedia that one of the additional features of knowledge in the internet age is a blurring of the boundaries between experts and citizens, producers and consumers. Whereas the model of scholarship in the pre-digital world was one in which scholars were producers and some general public were the consumers, and I would include students, first and foremost among this category of general public consumers. Now we're challenged with the need to restructure these relationships. The digital democracy toward which we aspire requires it. Were all knowledge held freely and openly, we would no doubt be empowered to impel this new democratic movement forward. And yet the emergence of the digital citizen scholar, along with techniques like crowdsourcing and distributed computing efforts like SETI at home, also raise questions about the legitimation and validation of knowledge. Lisbet gave some problematic examples yesterday. We could cite many others. The University of Connecticut, for instance, recently conducted a U.S. DOE, Department of Education, funded study of internet literacy among the so-called generation of digital natives, in which they fabricated a completely fictitious creature, the Pacific Northwest tree octopus in order to test students' ability to evaluate information they found on the internet. Students had no problem locating the website devoted to the Pacific Northwest tree octopus and insisted on the existence of the made-up tree or tree octopus, I don't know which it is, even after the researchers explained that the information on the website was completely fabricated. I can imagine a site dedicated to the hunting of the snark. You could probably also make up... Perfect. You could no doubt make up your own examples. But why bother when there are so many out there? The upshot is that we need processes that are not only bottom-up, but also top-down and in some kind of mix. Bottom-up and top-down, not only to root out misinformation and fallacies, but to help direct and shape knowledge pathways, which are not always best left unstructured. Models like intelligent browsing by means of the app Rabble browser or forms of curated digital collecting in which the library in essence becomes a publisher or museum of sorts are just a few. We need efforts like Bamboo's Corpora Space and Text Shop to explore the possibilities and challenges of web-based applications for research across dispersed and sometimes uncoordinated corpora. There's just too much information out there to go about this in any other non-intelligent way. Otherwise, the dream of a new Alexandria may well in turn turn into the disorienting maze of Borges' labyrinthine Library of Babel. At the same time, we need to uncover the many pathways and connections that have been forgotten or relegated to the dustbin of history because scholars have chosen to frequent other paths. Even where access is relatively open, academics tend to confine themselves to fairly limited cross-sections of corpora. Academics may well raise radical questions, but they don't always ask questions about how their material corpora evolved as privileged information bases or preferred information bases for what we have come to count as knowledge. But there is hope. As tools and platforms learn how to play with one another, as the web expands, as the tools to support it gain increasing sophistication, and of course, as access becomes more open, we may indeed be able to maximize the social benefits of what we might call the work of scholarship in the age of digital reproduction. Thank you.
Well, I too just like to thank you for coming and provoking this incredible conversation. It was hard to stop yesterday, and I'm delighted to have it continue today. It's so important to how we're trying to find our way forward here and everywhere. And I'd like to say, having had many conversations with you over many years, that I both agree and disagree a bit with your comments from yesterday. The agreement is that open access is a good thing and that we need to find a way to make it happen. Not for me. The disagreement a bit is with your analysis of how scholarly communication in the university came to be the way it is today. And as a historian, the how it came to be the way it is today question is, I think, mine. And one thing I think, again, we'd agree about is that the introduction, new technologies create expansion, new possibilities for the expansion of knowledge. And of course, as a historian of print culture, I see many resonances with the introduction of print to today. We have a new expansion, and we have a set of social responses to that new possibility, expansive possibility. And they also create new communications media as new markets. And I think you probably also agree that we're kind of in a historical moment of an emerging market still, a kind of booty capitalist moment that is relatively underregulated. And again, what I agree with totally is the need for greater regulation and civilization of this new media environment we're in. What I felt yesterday, and in reading your paper, was that this conversation is haunted by one of Michel Foucault's essays, and that famous essay, "What is an Author?" And many people, including myself, and here's where I'll disagree with myself, have read that essay as a story about the rise of the author as a proprietary entity. who took advantage of the commercialization of print and was complicitous with the publishing world in producing the author as property holding and commercial actor. But actually, I think that essay is about something deeper and something that touches right at the center of your talk, which is Foucault really is talking about the shift from the scientist as author to the humanist as author. That's really the underlying thrust of Foucault's essay, which is that prior to the French Revolution and prior to the emergence of print culture, the scientists were the great heroes of the early modern era. Newton was the most famous man in the early modern period, not Voltaire. And that what we see in the 19th and 20th centuries is the rise of the humanist as author and the disappearance of science as something that is authored. Yeah. And I raise that because it's so much at the center of your kind of sermon to us as humanists and social scientists. And I think it bears reflecting why are the scientists the ones who are ahead of the curve on open access, and the humanists and social scientists somehow seen as clinging to this old romantic theory of authorship and proprietorship that Foucault rightly, I think, imagined emerging in the 19th and 20th centuries. And so the conundrum, the shift from discovery to invention as the space of intellectual creativity and knowledge production produces a kind of paradox. It's a moment in which I think, as the author as proprietary subject emerges in the late 18th, early 19th century, science is actually becoming hegemonic. And I think that's Foucault's deepest point. It's a moment of scientific hegemony, precisely. It's not a moment of authorial triumph, or authorial triumph is the evil doppelganger of the naturalization of science as not being authored, and a scientific knowledge as something not being owned. This new kind of knowledge power, scientific knowledge, and the boundaries that are policing that boundary between scientific and humanistic, is in a sense naturalized. And that produces, and that naturalization, I think Foucault argues, is a kind of hegemonic move. And I think we're living still in that space, that hegemonic place of the sciences. The humanists and the social scientists, in this current, I think, market configuration, are in fact underwriting, by their knowledge production, the naturalization of the scientists. And I make this claim because, let me make this claim by paraphrasing one of my favorite phrases from Victor Hugo: "This will kill that." And when Victor Hugo wrote that he meant the book will kill the cathedral. That famous statement from Notre Dame, Hunchback of Notre Dame. And what I'd like to say is this will kill that. The scientific journal will kill the book. The scholarly social science and humanistic monograph. There would be no crisis of the monograph if the scientific journal were not eating up the budgets of every single library in this country, if the monopolistic practices that are really deeply most associated with the scientific world of publication, if there were a viable commercial model for scientific journal publishing, and I don't think PLOS yet can be declared a successful model, we'd be fine. So there was something about listening to your essay and your speech yesterday that made me wonder why we're seen as the problem rather than, in fact, the victims of the problem. And so it's not, and I don't think, and so I want to come back to that question about how the humanities and social sciences get positioned as the sort of Luddites of this conversation, whereas in fact, if you look at university budgets, there is a net transfer from the social sciences and the humanities to the natural and physical sciences. And that's the basic landscape on which this conversation about scholarly communication and the resources for organizing scholarly communication plays out. So I just want to highlight that for a moment and then talk a little bit about what is the right response to this. Not to become scientists, I think, necessarily. But I guess what I would like to dwell on just for a few more minutes before I end my comments is to think a little bit about where the resistance comes from in the humanities and the social sciences. And I don't think the resistance comes from a naivete about or a fantasy that we're going to make money by holding onto our copyrights, or a naivete about market economics. I think it actually comes from an anxiety. And interestingly, and the anxiety, there's something that we're clinging to and that we fear we are going to lose in this new world. And I think it's less the proprietary part of the copyright conundrum than it is the loss of autonomy and accountability, the moral rights in the property right conundrum. There's a kind of liberal anxiety that I think is actually worth worrying about. Someone raised it yesterday, a gentleman who talked about individualism. And the capacity to create an individuated product and the loss of control about that individuated product when it gets cast out into an under-regulated technology, which can be cannibalized and which can sprawl in different directions, which can be sampled, which can be, so that it can be manipulated in ways that are beyond control of an individual. Now, when anyone puts something into print, they know it's a moment of loss of control. But there is a way in which the humanistic sciences, the humanistic areas of study in particular have been, the great champions and guardians of that kind of liberal notion of the individual autonomy of knowledge production, the children of Diderot, if you will, rather than of Condorcet. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to be an apologist for the romantic, author here today, but to say that this anxiety, which actually you expressed in the very last paragraphs of your paper, which you didn't read yesterday. So I know you know what I'm talking about. You just, didn't, I think, ran out of time and compelled us to participate in this communications revolution for just the right reason. Because if we don't participate in the socialization and regulation of this new technology, that capacity to produce that kind of depth subjectivity, if you will, I think will be lost. And you state it more eloquently than I do in your paper. But so what's the solution to producing some kind of space? And I think this for producing a kind of liberal solution to this. And it is, I think, through some kind of not just regulation, but the production of a liberal architecture internal to these new digital media and to the digital marketplace through legal regulations that inflect incentives in the right ways and through the imposition of technological architecture that allows us to recreate authority, which we just heard a lot about, and accountability, which we just heard a lot about, and to restore, in some sense, what I think is a world out of balance. A balance that I still love of the great 18th century copyright laws before the term of copyright was extended from 10 to 70 or 100 years. The balance between a kind of a theory of individual autonomy and the public good. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, I think the problem with internet technology is it still, in some sense, bears the path dependencies of its origin in the sciences. And so there's a big project that we have to undertake to humanize and to socialize those technologies, to turn swords into plowshares, if you will. I mean, that control-kill key is still on the computer keyboard, even if it's probably not used very often anymore. And I think the answer is to make the state science complex pay, in some sense, pay us back for, give us back our fair share of the knowledge production, the fruits of knowledge production, the material fruits, and reinvest in a genuinely humanistic and social scientific digital architecture. And I think all of us here at Berkeley would absolutely sign on to that and have been working in our different ways, the three deans and the librarian here. I just think of Tony Cascardi's work with the Digital Humanities Project here, and also Celeste with Course Threads, which are an adaptation of a wonderful search engine to let students find their own course, navigate their way through courses at Berkeley. I think of the work that Anna Zexinian and I have been doing on creating a new digital D-Lab, a digital lab for the social sciences. So there's a huge amount of work to be done, and I think that where we should put the focus is not on the resistance of the humanities and the social sciences, but what I would call benign indifference of our academic administrators and to the great challenge, but also huge opportunity that I think is really critical to keeping our world not just democratic and universal, but also liberal and hospitable to individual self-actualization.
Carla, I'd like to confirm at the outset your theory that there's something deeply psychologically troubling about the way texts, what we write, are passing into new formats. I was in Washington 6 months ago and was invited to a social occasion where many freelance writers, some of them quite prominent, many of them very successful, get together and have dinner once a month and talk about the state of the world. And I was introduced as a newcomer as a librarian, and they kind of lit up, and you could feel they were about to applaud. And then my introducer said at that time we had digitized millions of books, old books, through Google, and they began to boo. They began to boo. There was something so troubling about that work, even though it actually wasn't theirs, taken away from them. They were actually much angrier about Google and Amazon than they were about me. But it really helps us to understand what Dr. Rausing and, I should say, Peter Baldwin have done here in moving their philanthropy into a field where you will be booed, where people will misunderstand. And there are many good ways to invest your time and wealth in which people will do nothing but thank you and pat you on the back. And this is not one of those areas. I note the courage it took. So the scripture I'm going to quote today comes from Jonathan Cole, longtime provost at Columbia, who recently completed a history of the modern research university. And this is the verse I like the most. The librarians and academic information staff are critically important to the quality of these institutions. They are, in many ways, custodians of culture. Well, this is where our troubles begin. Custodians of fine traditions don't have a great deal of the disruptive actor DNA. We have some of this DNA. Libraries killed off the card catalog, led the academy in organizing information into databases, and have reconfigured space so that it fits a new generation better than I think the rest of academia. Just as important, libraries, including this one, protect your privacy and civil liberties to the hilt. This library befriended the purest of the nonprofits, the Internet Archive, and the wiliest of the for-profits, Google, in order to get our collections out to the world at a pace faster than anyone had dreamed possible. As a founding member of the Hathi Trust, we have helped put 3.5 million digitized California volumes into the hands of anyone wishing to search them, and Hathi has more than 10 million digitized volumes overall, and 2.5 million of those are totally available today for full display anywhere you are near a computer and internet on the planet. And we are paying lawyers every month to defend us for doing this. Dr. Rausing mentioned that we take credit for talking tough to the Nature Publishing Group. We help fund Archive. That's the device that will allow that grandmother, I believe she was, in Omaha, to follow high energy physics. And we're one of the new supporters of that scheme. We have just as warmly welcomed open access initiatives as Stanford has been cold and distant, I have to tell you. The Berkeley Research Initiative, BRE, which provides Berkeley authors with funds to help get into open access, is one of the most successful of these programs across the country and was featured, so to speak, at the last Berlin 9 conference. We have gone to e-dissertations with free access through our e-scholarship repository. Here I have to say Stanford also deserves an A. We did the same for the celebrated Mark Twain autobiography. Yes, we published it commercially and profitably, but we also gave everything online, the scholarly edition, free to all comers. The online Archive of California, we've contributed a lot, UCLA has contributed a lot, has put a vast amount of material into the lesson plans of K-12 schools in California and around the world. In February, the California Digital Library helped us join the Public Knowledge Project, another effort for open source publishing. And I could go on and I would sound more and more defensive as I went down a list of good things. Custodians of culture, it goes with the job. We've come to think the Academy, as we look at it, as a place where seasonal change is possible, spring into summer, not phase transitions, water to ice. Dr. Rausing and I were chatting yesterday about the transformative moments in American higher education and quickly agreed that the GI Bill was one, the modern turn to coeducation another, and you can add to the list, I'm sure, the new globalization of the undergraduate student body may be another instance in which old ways of thinking simply snap and are forgotten. Dr. Rausing has said that the transformation to open access is so complex and touches so many parts of the academy that partial change will likely fail. Everything must start moving at the same time. I would say that the new thinking about access in the university has to be preceded by cracks in the old order. We are pounding on those cracks, exploiting them wherever we can. The custodians of culture can live with and ought to welcome, as I do, being in a vanguard for change. That, I think, is what the UC Library, this campus, and to some extent the whole University of California system has been doing. Are we getting anywhere? Last week, I actually thought so, and I had one of these moments I want to share. There was a gathering of a few provosts and a few university librarians in the office, the Washington office of the Association of American Universities, which would style itself as the elite universities of North America. And we thought this was just going to be another meeting where the problem would be diagnosed. But I have to say that within that organization there's leadership that may lead to something quite dramatic and far-reaching fairly soon. AAU presidents are to be briefed on these plans next week. So looking at the high road that I think is the Rausing road of transparency, open debate, enlightened leaders formulating policy and implementing it, I think there's probably more hope than there has been in the past. But I wanted to close with contrasting that road. I'm very happy to be on that road. I hope we are on that road with a lower road, because the historian in me notices that often the lower road can have dramatic effects and sometimes does great good. The United States did not get to a point where information was widely and cheaply shared across immigrant cultures, across a great continent, simply by a high road. There was a shadowy patchwork of subsidies that accomplished this. Exploitation of the postal system to make publications cheap and widespread was an important part of it. We've enjoyed low postage rates, free exchanges of much material, exemption from the sales tax, patronage appointments, and to our own day, the obstruction of the sidewalks for sales, and let us not forget child labor. All of those things brought us information cheaply, and they were very important in the education of ordinary Americans. Public knowledge exploded with these cheap publications. They sometimes took the form of the republication of what we would now call in the library GovDocs on science and health matters. But there were reasons why, going to Carla's talk about the scientists, where important scientific information was spread amazingly effectively. This is the reason that people could read William James' essays in popular mechanics. And inventors such as Thomas Edison and Nicholas Tesla and their ideas filtered into the general knowledge. These subsidies in the popular press begin to resemble some of the hidden forms of public investment that Dr. Rausing explained are really part of the status quo. Is there a chance to follow that lower road and to get somewhere in the university by having policies that are not as explicit but may be more effective? What about hidden supports for knowledge? And we can translate this easily to what they would be in the university. More favorable indirect cost rates for universities that go open access. You want to get an administrator excited, you talk about indirect cost rates. Better student loan rates for universities that go open access. Audit and compliance intervals lengthened if you go open access. Faster paths to visas for those who go open access. There's a whole array of things that don't look very glorious unless you have the job of a dean or another administrator that actually might be quite interesting incentives. Thank you.
No FTE unless you go.
Well, 3 hard acts to follow. Thank you for a really stimulating talk and also conversation thus far. I will say that if you Google in the last 24 hours, there were 3 articles that came out saying open access threatens academic publishers. One of the world's best business models is about to be disintermediated. And then in The Guardian, disintermediated. You don't. They're going to lose their role, their critical role between the scholar. And then the Guardian says science must be liberated from the paywalls of the publishers. And finally, Forbes, no less the capitalist tool, says the coming collapse of the academic publishing model. So it's your fault. Yeah. You are in very good company. That just came out at 10 this morning. And then, of course, UNESCO just produced its open access guidelines this week. So I do think you're on the right side of history and that, you know, we should be. I'm going to sound a bit like a grouchy dean, so bear with me. But I will say that I'm the dean of a school where everybody believes in open access. All of them put all of their materials up for free. This is, you know, just sort of taken as a sort of part of the air we breathe. But one of the things that I'm reacting to is a little bit similar to Carla's reactions, is that this isn't a simple binary, open versus closed. I mean, we can start to put these things together, past versus future, right? It's open, you know, or future versus past, I should say, public versus private, good, bad, free, costly. It's a complex issue. One of the complexities, I think, was mentioned before, which is that even open access costs some money, and we need to find ways to not only pay for reviewing, editing, designing, and distribution of the material, but also preservation. Digital preservation is a huge scientific and technical problem that we haven't solved, and we don't know how much it will cost, if at all. So I guess with my dean's hat on, I want to talk about political economy and also sort of go a bit to some preliminary thoughts about what is the public good in today's world. Dr. Rausing describes the political economy of publishing that we all understand pretty well. The monopolistic rents are extracted by scholarly publishers today off of the backs of those of us scholars, research that is funded by tax dollars. And she didn't mention, but I will right here as a footnote, just that I actually think that a lot of the journal reference process itself is fairly undemocratic. It supports old boys networks often, or I should call them citation cliques, that don't allow new ideas necessarily to make it easily in. But that's, and I actually think that today most of the really good ideas come out online first in working papers or blogs or things like that. So put that aside. But I want to look at the political economy at the university for a minute. There's no doubt that the web and these technologies are what's driving this democratization, really vast democratization of research and knowledge, which we all applaud at very low cost, liberating us from these publishers. But I also think it's affecting the university in very deep ways, and ways that need to be explored in conjunction with talking about open access. And I'm going to throw in a quote here that I'll come back to. One of the things that Dr. Rausing says on page 2 is those who live off their works should self-evidently be allowed to sell them on the open market, acknowledging one time the importance of ownership of intellectual property rights in some way. She also, in a lot of footnotes, talks about videos, open courseware, all of the formats that we're seeing for opening up access to knowledge products of different kinds. But just as the publishing industry is being disintermediated, the very same technological and economic pressures are also undermining, I think, some of the basic foundations of the Western university and its monopoly over post-secondary education. Okay, elite universities like those publishers are also institutions that artificially constrain supply. We are highly selective. We serve as filters, just like the journals did, that are used to credential what is a quality person, graduate. Our graduates, the ones that get into Berkeley, are therefore certified. And, no matter, obviously we do something in between, but by getting into Berkeley, you get the credential of the Berkeley degree. And this is an important piece of certification is an important piece of authentication of, what is good quality. All those things are being thrown up for grabs. Now, public universities haven't historically taken economic advantage of the economic power that we have of our selectivity the way the privates have, right? With their tuitions, I'm currently paying one, and soon to be 2 private school tuitions, and it is extortionate. So I think I'm not bemoaning the loss of that particular model, but the fiscal crisis that we're in is now forcing us to start also charging tuition. Public universities that were really once protected, shielded from the need to respond to economic pressure, we're now heavily exposed. Only 10% of our revenue today comes from the state. And the pressure, I don't think that's stopping. I don't think it's coming back. Some people will say to me, oh, California, the economy will bounce back. No. This is a deep, long-term structural problem that we're going to have to address internally. Unfortunately, we're also very conservative institutions. It's very hard to change these institutions, and there's so many protections in place sort of for the way things are. So the web not only has created the opportunity to open access, but also for a whole bunch of other entrepreneurs to enter the space that we're in. And we are surrounded here in the Bay Area by businesses, some small, others not so small, that are seeking to get into the business that we do by credentialing skills, capabilities, meeting the demand for lifelong learning that's emerging all over, and at a much lower cost than the university as we know it today. I'll just give a few examples. We know about at Stanford, Udacity, and Coursera, which you applaud because they are providing open access to the lectures of their brilliant professors, free on the open market. Well, Stanford can afford it. Larry Summers is the chair of the board of Minerva, which you may have heard of, raised $25 million in venture capital to create an online Ivy, which is designed to meet the huge global demand for Ivy League quality education online to talented youth from India, China, Brazil, who aren't being admitted or can't get in because we're too selective to the elite Western universities. Their business model is to offer online courses taught by, and I quote here, highly esteemed faculty from other established universities. Does that mean you or you? We're free to do that, right?
We're free anyway, right?
No, this is going to cost students money. He's going to make money. But they'll offer a lot less, okay? $20,000 as opposed to what, $50 I'm paying for the University of Chicago for tuition, okay, 50 or 60. So the ultimate threat, of course, to the university is the disaggregation of the degree itself, right? There's all students can simply move outside of the formal university and take advantage of free open source courses that are proliferating everywhere, and there's businesses out there giving credentials. You can have a series of badges, you can work at Google now if you took that Coursera class and got an A in artificial intelligence. We're not quite at personalized degrees, but those are, people are thinking about those. Competency-based credentials could well replace the kind of degrees that we're granting. We're pretty vulnerable, I'll just say. Having sat as dean for many years, it's very hard for us to change. And we know the things that need to change, and yet, God, is it hard. I guess I want to go back to the economics and say all of these are products of universities' faculty members or their intellectual property. It's not just their research anymore. It is their research, but it's also their teaching, their curriculum development, the work that essentially we're being paid by the university to do that are increasingly available on open access and even being exploited by other entrepreneurs if Larry Summer gets his way, okay? Well, how are these faculty now, as the market is exploding the institutions, how are they different from those who should self-evidently be able to sell their work on the open market? Should they be able to provide all of their IP to Minerva, to Coursera for free, even though the university pays their salaries and allows them to produce the research? I couldn't have written a book without my university salary. Shouldn't the university get some of this money? Isn't there some value? Not just, I think Carla highlighted the deeper, the autonomy, the individual but there are economic returns that are built in. I don't believe copyright should be as long as it is. We can go and debate that. I think it should be much shorter. I think our laws, a bunch of our intellectual property laws are broken. But I still believe that may be one of the only ways to preserve the institution that we're sitting in today. And I guess want to just leave it on, what do we do, open everything up at the, to the expense of the survival of the university itself?
That's very interesting. I will just make a few dispersed comments, and then I'm sure we will want to all talk with each other. The first point that I hear from all of you is the point of legitimacy, accountability, priority disputes, peer reviews. And my only comment on that is that I think in principle it should be possible to tease apart questions of quality control and the medium in which we publish. But the deeper point you're making, and again it really comes from all of you, is this sense that everything flies apart. The person of the author, the publications that we put out, and even our institutions ourselves. And that disaggregation, that splintering, that fragmentation, my only comment on it would be that it is happening. It's not something we can wish away. Tony, you gave a really compelling description of the chaos that can ensue. But that chaos is already there. The Scythian lamb is there in the internet. And my relatively modest proposal to put the already curated bodies of knowledge in among the Scythian lambs will not really solve the issues you're talking about, but nor would they complicate these issues. I mean, there are forms of self-organizations on the web that are encouraging, like Wikipedia. New orders also do emerge. And my concern is what happened to that thought through, individuated, automated knowledge of the humanists if we're not in and out of that new self-organizing world. So how to integrate ourselves into the web when the web seems like that sort of machine of cracking everything into small pieces. I suppose I would say that my only plea would be that we do integrate ourselves on the web, but with the knowledge that we have no idea what this means and what will happen. It's unknowable. And for sure, institutions, persons, even the very size of the sort of individual objects of scholarship that we produce will look utterly different 25 years from now than it does today. But we can't predict what it will look like, and we can't control it even. All we can try to do is to take our patrimony, that which we have built up, that tradition that you very eloquently spoke about, Carla, and offer up also that, because for sure, by holding it back, whatever comes out of this web will not be richer, wiser, more thoughtful, more humanist. But the question is, how do we find a vocabulary and language that appropriately expresses our desire to be a responsible part of this? And the language that I used yesterday, and Celeste very rightly pointed that out, is highly instrumentalist. I talk about taxpayers. That's how the web talks about this. They see it as a sort of economic right or political right, possibly a citizen's right, but that's as far as they go. But it's something more than that. It's something deeper than that, and that's what you're pointing at. I mean, you could think of it as terms of repatriating patrimony, almost like returning the treasures to the communities that originated them, like we are learning to do with the First Nations of the American continent. I mean, if you think of the Dumbarton Index of Christian Art, that is a spiritual patrimony for the Christian communities across the world, often very poor faith communities, which has been thoughtfully curated and is now unavailable to those very same communities. Their patron saints, their Virgin Marys, their monasteries, their holy texts, gone. We looked after it. We in fact improved it because we ordered it, we understood it, we source critiqued it. Isn't it time to give it back? So how we find a language of community, of respect, of political engagement that sort of picks up on the points that you all have made, I think is a great challenge, because until we do, we don't really have the sort of language that can allow all of us to create a sort of ideology. It was very sweet and amusing yesterday that, some of you are here today too, that the Scandinavian department came up as a body and said, well, we know what you're talking about. I'm Swedish. And of course, I hadn't thought of it, but those scholars were absolutely right. I was talking about something that we in Sweden call folkbildningsidealet. The ideology of, ideal, not ideology, the ideal of educating the people, which swept our country in the early part of the 20th century and was a sort of politically radical movement, but also one of mutual respect among all people of our nation, by building up new institutions, by creating new forms of publication, by even redefining what an author was. And I have to say, that was an entirely benign movement. That was a good movement. And the question is, whether there is something like that for us now, and whether we can find a language that would capture that. And then whether we, who sit on all these extraordinary treasures, can be, well, the generous patron saints of that sort of widening of humanist ideologies and humanist scholarship.
Thank you. As I listened to all of you, particularly to Dr. Rausing's remarks, I couldn't help thinking that your suggestion actually might not be a metaphor for what should happen in the university as a community, not just, the library, as a source of information. Thank you.
Well, I think that some of the things that the panel talked about really were about this unknown future and things falling apart. I thought what Lisbet was talking about was actually not about something so radical. In fact, in some sense, it seemed something very old-fashioned, and that makes you come back to the sort of question of commons and public on the one hand, and the privatization of commons on the other. So there were once great numbers of common lands, and common lands were enclosed in all sorts of ways and became vastly more productive. And then there came a time in the early 20th century when people started reclaiming common lands that had now become productive, and we had a now much richer country which could afford to put walkways and do all these nice things with common lands and have state national parks and so forth. Carla has written a book about what happened when they thought that literature, publishing should be commons. And things fell apart. That really was radical. So we privatized it again. So the interesting thing about this is that, in some sense, for much of the 19th and the 20th century, there was a relatively common model. Journals weren't terribly expensive. They were subsidized by learned societies and the state. And then at some moment, there's this divergence. The Carlton science took off and became privatized. And it becomes another model. So when Varmus and all these guys tried to get Congress to pass a law making NIH grants dependent on publishing immediately in open access, it was voted down because it's totally privatized. On the other hand, journals like We Publish Representations is sort of semi-privatized. That is to say, our deans support half of it. And the Townsend Center half of it. I don't know exactly. But anyway, publicly supported out of university funds. On the other hand, the university press tells us that the other half or whatever comes from money which they get from JSTOR, which needs to be, right? And then there's this completely privatized things which are now utterly public, like you can get some of the Wall Street Journal online for free, which is public knowledge, or semi-public because some of the information comes from, say, ProPublica, which is philanthropized. But in any case, it's private knowledge which they make public because they finance it through advertising. So it seems to me that a lot of this depends on the ends of the history of the commons, that you actually do need to privatize in order to produce this material, whether at each stage, and then in some sense to figure out how much it's going to cost to republicize some part of it. Yeah. And so, I suppose I'd like the panelists and you to talk a little bit. What philosophically, that doesn't seem terribly problematic. Some Republicans defend the monopoly practices of Elsevier, but that's not an argument that's going to win the day. So then the question comes down: well, what actually is the cost, or how it would meet the cost of, let's say, making the entire JSTOR archive, which was your point, publicly available? Yeah. With my labor and all our labor and representations being essentially free, the deans contributing X amount, the press, are we talking $2 billion, $10 billion? I mean, I guess I don't have a sense of what the cost is to re-socialize different levels of this commons, which can't literally be commons, because if it actually went back to commons, it wouldn't get done.
So,
Right?
so I hear you.
You know,
Yes.
as history has shown.
Yeah, I hear you completely. I just have two quick comments on that, and then I'm sure the other panel will want to. We actually, as a charity, were in very deep discussion.
Sorry, I just
We actually, as a charity, Peter and I were in very deep discussions with JSTOR to make it public domain, precisely because there are so many flagships in there. And I thought, and Peter thought, that it would be important to have the flagship scholarship in the public domain. And they then thought, and Peter, you will correct me if I remember wrongly, that it might be something like $300 million, which we thought, together with other funders, we could actually raise. But they then backed out, I think it's fair to say, from those discussions, not because they're really good guys, because they were overwhelmed by the complexity of getting all the permissions. And so they just couldn't really. It was the transaction cost that sort of killed that, and we were very sorry about that. So that's my one comment. My second comment is simply that I entirely agree with your comments. I would add to that you remember the old saying, I love paying taxes because with taxes I pay for civilization.
Or well-known Tea Party slogan.
But America has, like all other civilized developed countries, already entirely agreed on the principle that some cost we just pool as citizens and then distribute out again. And that is the fundamental way in which universities are funded. And whether the different mechanisms for it, but whether it's for tax breaks or grants, it is where it comes from. So since we have agreed on building roads, building bridges, we might as well also build a knowledge depository for the citizenry.
Well, I think I want to ask a question about, and it's a wonder that I have, a worry that I have, a question about where the internet, the web, sits vis-a-vis the process of commodification. On some accounts, what's happened with the web is a kind of as a hyper version of a certain form of commodification, and there's the possibility, there's the hope that it might in the end produce something like a commons, which is the flip side of the fear that it might result in a kind of hyper-alienation. And I think some of what Carla was saying speaks directly to that issue, but I think it's very unclear, and it's certainly unclear to me, much as I am in favor of sort of enhanced tools for web access and integration and so forth, but I still do wonder and worry about where that all sits vis-a-vis the steady onward process of commodification. And I wonder if what do you think about that?
No, please ask a question. We talk all the time.
Well, my answer is very simple. I think it's unknowable. I really think we're stepping out in the dark, and we cannot know what comes out of it.
But I react strongly when you say this is all unknowable, because it's not just the web that's driving it, it's people. This is a political process. We can shape it. There are people creating walled gardens on the internet right now.
Creating what?
Walled gardens, right? Hiving off parts that have to be paid for, that are proprietary. There are parts of the web that are open, and I think we need to empower ourselves rather than saying it's all open, to say this is the society we want, and this is the kind of internet that we want, and work on it that way. I fear that I love Scandinavia. I think it's I really actually do, but I think it is unthinkable, maybe from your perspective, that the state would not continue to fund the university. It's not unthinkable in the US. I hate to say it, but I mean, private universities will continue.
I guess I'd want to try to distinguish between two things, which is, the problem of an economic model of making things available on the web. And I think there are parts of that unknowability of the consequences of that just have to be seen. And I've had some experience having some of my papers, preprints, posted on an open access site, and it's a wonderful experience. People who I think would have never necessarily read them in journals read them, and scholars at lesser universities who would not have the journals, who couldn't find out about conference announcements and read the papers that are posted. So I'm completely appreciative of some of the positive sides of this. But there is the question about the shaping of this conversation. We're not just casting things out and watching and wonder. We're also acting in that world and producing the kind of infrastructure internal to it, the architecture, the metadata, the search engines, that question to me is where universities are best at giving back, because we are the people who understand all of those technical challenges. We understand the consequences of choosing one way to organize a table of contents or an index or a tag over another. And there, I think, is at least as much of the solution as the universities putting all of their university professors putting all of their content on the line. I mean, I think online, I think what we really have to give back as deans, actually, is less, I will give your department, a research fund if it signs an open access agreement. They'd sign it anyway but inviting them to create digital projects and products that are encoded with and sustained by the kinds of values that we want to nurture on that web. So I think it's not just a challenge of watching and releasing knowledge and watching and wondering, but from our perspective, I think as deans, it's about inhabiting that world and with all of the kind of scholarly expertise that our faculty can bring to it.
I've become disturbed as the discussion went along, or has gone along, that suddenly the public has literally disappeared from this discussion. And the demand side, if there is a demand, seems to me extremely fuzzy. I'm very skeptical of all these little old ladies in Montana wanting to get on, the astrophysics site, frankly. The reason is not a cynicism about little old ladies, but rather that we live in a society which has none of the social and cultural movements that buoyed up what Lisbet was referring to in the Volksschule movement in Denmark, in Sweden and Britain, in the 19th century, the mechanics institutes, the hunger of working people to break into. I mean, this is not a matter of, in the 19th century, going out and delivering. These people were actually breaking into libraries and universities to get in and at this information and this knowledge. Now, are you really confident, or can we be really confident that the school systems of the late 20th and early 21st century have generated the same levels of curiosity and desire and demand that we hear referred to in some of these earlier historical episodes. You see what I'm trying to get at here? We may well be looking into an abyss here rather than,
Well,
that's it. I'm a little bit hysterical, but that's all right.
I think you're a little bit hysterical, John. I mean, I appreciate that we're living in a certain moment in the United States of America, but the world's young are yearning for knowledge, so they may not be yearning in the young in Omaha, but the older in Omaha are probably still yearning for it. But
admitted they weren't interested in the physics journal as well.
my mother would be.
All I'm trying to get at here is I'm not sure what percentages we're talking about. And unfortunately, I hear it shrinking with each statement toward 5%, 1%. And where is the
You might
vast?
have data on
No, I
this.
don't, I'm not going to answer the percentages, but the issue of what is the public good, I mean, you've defined it as access to all the scholarly journals, but we could also define it differently. I mean, it might be a curated internet which scholars have shaped in and provided authority to. It might be a university that everybody could afford to attend. There are many different public goods, and they are not always mutually they often conflict if you have a state that's going to fund them. So this is one public good. I happen to support it, but
I think we have to be somewhat careful to think that in order for the general public, many of whom, after all, have gone to college, almost all of whom are literate, in order for them to properly appreciate our patrimony, we have to wrap it very carefully. And I think also we should be very careful indeed in making sort of assumptions about that. Was it Stalin who said that there's something wrong with these people, so let's exchange the people? Or Lenin? Yes, it's an act of faith to believe in people's curiosity, goodwill, and so on. But it would be enormously surprising to me if the people of this world somehow could not assimilate, could not learn from, could not take on from the very excellent body of knowledge that we presently withhold from them.
But I think along with that, I'm reminded of my role as a professor in the classroom, and I'm sure others here think of similar things, where I least often think of my position as imparting information or disseminating knowledge. I think one of the best things I can do is to instigate a kind of curiosity, to awaken a curiosity, to help shape it, to help direct it. Beyond that, I can't do a whole lot. So I think if the potential power of these open access works is to be realized, it has to be accompanied somehow by a pedagogical, call it a pedagogical component. Otherwise, it will appear vast, disaggregated, useless.
I think that's, of course, entirely right, but it's not necessarily our job to do that as well. I mean, small nodes of learning communities already spontaneously form across the world. This would just give them tools to then organize their own learning.
Several of us here are members of the library and, what's it called now? The Library and Information Technology Committee of the Berkeley Division of the Academic Senate, and I want to make an advertisement on behalf of some of our hard work, which is working with the university-wide Library and Scholarly Communications Committee to think yet again about potential open access policy for UC. And the model that many of our peer institutions have after we thought hard about it and didn't do it in a failed effort several years ago, is what I think in the context of this conversation would be characterized as a very modest model, which is for faculty members to give their institutions non-exclusive rights to disseminate mostly their journal articles. And so this might sound like the kind of thing that has been characterized as modest and would potentially just lead to chaos and not the kind of curation to which we aspire. But I want to put in a plug for this kind of modest model, because it turns out, I think, speaking for myself, that some of us can do scholarship, but we don't actually know from curation. But we have institutional professionals like Tom and his staff, for example, and people in the information school and elsewhere who do know how to do the curation that could make our scholarship a more powerful part of the hive mind that Lisbeth encouraged us to energize. And the problem is that our institutions are in the same situation as JSTOR. They have lots of great ideas, but they don't necessarily have the rights to do what they would do on our behalf with some of our scholarship in terms of disseminating it. So these modest efforts I see as ways to just overcome some of the transaction costs that might stand between modestly posting your own paper on the web and having it be curated by institutions who can make that dissemination much more powerful because it could be more comprehensive, more curated, etc. So I hope that you will participate in what I expect to be discussions about that and see if you agree how that modest step could be part of this bigger vision for curation.
Molly, would you identify yourself so they can fall in behind you?
Yes. So I'm Molly Van Helling. I'm on the faculty at the law school where I teach intellectual property. So that's where my expertise on this topic comes. I'm also on the board of Creative Commons, which has been an outside institutional actor in promoting open access dissemination of various types.
So, Lisbet, I'd like you to actually speak to this question of faculty mandates for open access, because you've said that it's not going to happen by professors, activist professors. So what do you think of this from below, kind of making stuff available? It seems to me it's not a bad way to begin. Given that you've said it really has to go from the top, that this revolution you're talking about is going to have to come from the top, I don't like the way that sounds. And so given that we have deans here and administrators, can you talk a little bit about how it would happen from the top? I mean, are we talking about legislation? Are we talking about some kind of treaty among university presidents? I mean, what are you actually thinking about when you speak of these top-down things as opposed to these modest efforts that Molly just referred to?
So I think at the minimum, a good research university should have an opt-out, well-curated digital repository. Opt-out means that the assumption is that all scholars lodge all scholarship in it, but if for some reason they're publishing in Nature or they promise to, they can opt out. It's very odd, but scholars behave like we ordinary citizens behave, for example, for organ donation. If you have opt-in, you get, well, it varies, but 30-40% perhaps. If you have opt-out, you get much, much higher numbers. That is really puzzling to me as a sort of quandary about the human mind, but it's the case. So opt-out, well-funded, centrally run, curated for the future. That would be absolute minimum. I also think that the universities, each one, but they should talk with each other as they do it, should really make a sustained effort to refold the university presses back into the universities. I was talking to Leslie Kirk, who's here somewhere, about the problem in this very small language-rich humanities, where a traditional PhD is practically impossible today to publish, because there aren't enough university libraries that can afford them. And so that sort of tilts those fields away from philological skills that they really do need, also for the future. And so we do need to see, in my view, the university presses as service organs to the university, rather than semi-independent for-profit centers. So that would be two examples of...
We'll support that.
We will support that.
We aren't going to get it.
I'm fascinated to hear what Leslie had to say, but what I really want to know is what the Chancellor had to say.
Or what about the president of the UC system? Where's he today? Where's Mark Udoff?
One thing that I found quite interesting in this conversation about JSTOR and is the sort of the challenge of fragmentation. And I think because it's weirdly mirrored in the anxiety about fragmentation, but the fragmentation of decision rights that is produced by the complexity of this problem. And I'm sure you've thought, along with many of the people you mentioned in this paper, about that, and I'm sure you learned a lot about that from the JSTOR experience, but I think that this is perhaps one of the reasons this has to occur from the top. That is, by some kind of reform that is more root and branch, whether it's a reform of our copyright law, whether it's a reform of our antitrust law, whether it's a reform of, then can be negotiated or navigated. It's what you said yesterday about if we all jump through together,
Yeah.
it can happen. But that great leap forward, I don't want to use that much, you know. well, but that's what I think she's exactly. So how do you think about, you know, you've been preaching to us as civil society actors in the unfolding of this drama. And I think we all feel, on the one hand, immensely sympathetic, and on the other hand, immensely helpless.
Yes.
To do much more than
Absolutely.
You know.
So what's the 5-year plan? I don't have experience with at all the American political system. From a total outsider's perspective, it looks like each individual senator and congressman is for sale. So if you want to be really, really cynical about it, we should simply outbid people like Reed Elsevier. It took $15,000 to buy Maloney of New York for the Research Work Act. That's not much. That's all they gave her. And in response to that, she wrote a proposal for law that would ban all public access from all federally funded research. Now, that won't go through because Reed Elsevier themselves withdrew. When Timothy Gowers, who is a sort of saint at Cambridge, began organizing the boycott. So that's your political system. In England, we do have a lot of contacts with the top decision makers. I would say there, the issue is not corruption, but it's lack of attention, lack of grasping issues. I think England has had now 5 or 6 reviews on intellectual rights and copyrights over the last 10 years. Good reviews by good people. Hargreaves, which is the latest, is an excellent review. They would do very well just taking all these proposals. But it gets bogged down in their total inability to educate themselves about what a research university is. I would say the British political classes believe, because none of them have postgraduate education, believe that the university is their Oxford colleges. They don't know really what research is. They can't grasp it. So how do we go from A to B? If I was president of a university, which thank goodness I'm not, and couldn't. and couldn't possibly be. I think the first thing I would have wanted to do is to create a task force across the university, and then say, with the sort of good people in the university, what can we do to keep our house as much as possible in order? And then sort of spend a year, possibly 2 years, to do what we can do, convincing our university press to put a non-income producing tail in open domain, fixing our depository and so on. And then when we've done everything we could do, then starting working with our other universities and just formulating. I think it might be time for the universities to lobby more openly in the US. Not only the quiet word in the ear of, but be a little bit more pushy, a little bit more tough.
Wait, there's someone behind you.
First, I want to say that I was born in Omaha, and so was my mother and my grandmother. And when I grew up, the access to scholarship I had was the Encyclopedia Americana, which we had a set of in our home. But I'd like to make 2 points. First of all, it seems to me to an extraordinary degree in the age of Googleization, we already have a form of open access, and we're all using it, aren't we? I mean, if I wanted to find out what the 5 panelists have written, that's where I would go today, and I would probably get quite a bit about each of you. If I wanted something more substantial on Linnaeus, I would go to your book that Harvard published 11 years ago, I believe. And I would get a long-form book, peer-reviewed book that had the Harvard imprint on it, and that would be another level of access to knowledge, and a significant one, it seems to me. I feel that the thing that's at risk, as you were suggesting a few moments ago, is really the monograph, the scholarly monograph that comes out of the research universities that represents the real great strength of the research universities. And it really is at risk. And it's at risk in part because of the free access to knowledge through the internet. Now, I'm not against it. I mean, I use it and desire it just as all the rest of us do. But I think what we really need to care about is the loss of this long-form, peer-reviewed, carefully prepared research that exists in books.
I share your sympathy and concern about deep reading, and I think it is one of the things that is least well suited to, thus far, the transformations, although e-readers are getting to be quite interesting. But I think what's killing them is not open access. What's killing them is the monopolies on scientific scholarly journals that are just eating up the budgets of libraries and are eating up, and they're part of the further warp of our entire research landscape by the way in which subscriptions to Brain Magazine are then written into research grants that are applied for by our math and physical science or biological science faculty to the NSF. So the government is paying for that. And indirectly, we're all paying for that. And what I really appreciated in your formulation yesterday is those are forms of us all paying for this. But I mean, I didn't mean to be as tendentious or sound anti-science, because I'm not anti-science. But I do think there's been a lack of transparency in the politics of research universities and the complexity of the way in which their instructional and research missions are folded into each other as a fiscal proposition. that has created a situation in which you're hearing more whining than I think any of us wish you were hearing, but is a part of the reality of the ways in which, the commercialization of scholarly publication has really made our lives quite challenging. So I think your analysis is wrong in that I don't think it's open access. It's actually publishing monopolies on scientific journals that have been the biggest threats to our...
It's surely more complicated than you're saying and I would say. It's many factors.
It is many factors, but...
I'm just so struck by Tom Leonard said we have many lawyers working on defending us from this open access, and others have spoken about the more general, and you spoke about the problem with JSTOR was not $200 million, but was that they couldn't figure out who to pay, who to get the contract from. And the more one just reads, in The Economist, as to what corporations now become authors, and they become authors essentially in perpetuity. We have our podcast on for free, but we'd want to try to include clips that we borrow from your library. Gary Handman is very strict, is our media librarian, in how many seconds of a clip you're allowed to have on the, on your free podcast. And so you multiply that with incredible complexity by many factors of 10. It seems the deep underlying issue is less the monopolies, which are clearly indefensible, which will go sometime soon into paying twice. Well, sometime it's going to pass. We're going to have a Democratic Congress. NIH is going to say you have to publish open access right away, applause or not applause. And then it's going to happen. I mean, it's 10 votes. It doesn't seem conceptually. I think Carla's right about the cost of this, but if NIH and NSF and the British Research Council and the French national, 6 governmental agencies start demanding that, it's going to happen. That doesn't seem conceptually difficult. It'll happen. If not now, it'll happen. But the deeper issue seems to me this unbelievably complex system of intellectual property, which we have, which you can't sort through for JSTOR, which is not serious property and not such a big deal. When you get into real property that people really care about, it seems to me well beyond university presidents and even sort of beyond breaking certain monopolies, and a much deeper, almost revolutionary restructuring of intellectual property. I don't know much about, but what you read about is it becomes more and more private rather than more and more public.
I very, very much agree with your comment. And in the footnotes to this paper, I quote one example, which is also quoted in the Hargreaves Review. British Library attempting to digitalize sound recordings that were oral histories with British jazz musicians recorded in the mid-1980s. And it was just a moving of a already done public interview from one medium to another. And for about a third of the interviews, because they couldn't get hold of the jazz musicians, they died, they moved to America, they didn't leave forward in their address, they simply couldn't do it. And this is a particularly bad problem in Britain, but the tightness and transaction costs of how we just move already public data from one set of technologies to another is really shocking.
Tom, I wanted to comment. Authors have taken some hits in this conversation as being sometimes irrational or unwilling to share. But I think Molly will back me on this. When there are hearings and when the public is asked for its opinion about reform of copyright, a whole new cast of characters show up. Right. Photographers, illustrators, artists of various kinds, people who design wallpaper. And some pretty calm lawyers in Washington call some of these people the crazy people, because they go way beyond what even authors think about the potential commercial rights. And it is enough to lessen even your faith in democracy in this process. So I actually think the idea of, as strange as it may seem, of university chancellors and presidents mandating something is more likely than Congress listening to the public, reforming our laws in this area.
Lisbet, can I ask a related question? Do you have a clear articulation of where a university ends, let's say the University of California, and Hollywood begins?
I'm afraid I don't understand the question.
Because you say, we'll leave Hollywood to Hollywood.
Yeah.
But there's just a huge sort of border zone in there that's neither Hollywood nor University of California, any other university that is.
Oh, that's absolutely right. And I mean, for some fields like literature, it would be, we might get out our own scholarly literature, but we can't get out the primary sources from which it draws. That seems to me almost unsolvable, but at the very least, by putting out this sort of deep authorial monograph length or article length, a sort of rounded product as almost exemplars on the web would itself be helpful, even though the public couldn't always cross-reference down.
Do you imagine it to be so difficult to create public libraries on the web? Why would it be so difficult if we did not have these publishing monopolies? You know, I mean, the infrastructure, we know, there isn't, the challenges are not that new, really. But, to put the novel in some kind of, to carve out the spaces so that audience access is to create a successful commercial settlement that is, on the one hand, essentially universal, and on the other hand, economically sustainable. This just doesn't seem to be that complex a problem if you remove from this. That's why I talked about returning to a balance. We have a market that is so radically underregulated, and with a real low water mark in the 1990s. I mean, just a horrible low water mark in the 1990s, which seems to me to be reversible.
I think that's exactly right, and there is a perfectly functional and good model, which is collective licensing, but that would have to come from Washington. It's not what we can do.
Right.
I participated in a group discussion of mostly faculty while the university was increasing its tuition to try to list what it is that University of California, Berkeley has to offer the public. And in this discussion, almost every single thing was scientific. And then I raised my hand and I said, well, are there any things that we can be proud of that they would understand in the humanities? And the only thing that they were able to come up with was, and you would know better than I, that there was a divorce law that came through one of the faculty in the law school that made a difference to the state of California. So I think that the hard part is that here we are, we're humanists, and we share this love of general knowledge, and I agree with you that it is something that is really for the people, but I don't think that when it comes to justifying the university these days, that the people who are making the decisions understand that.
Oh, I so agree with you. And it's such a worry. How do you capture the value of the immeasurable? And this sort of, well, again, I was guilty of it yesterday. This highly instrumentalist view. It's about taxpayers. It's about sort of technology developments out of the high-tech stuff that we do here. It's very, very worrisome. I mean, even if you look at the Budapest Open Access Alliance, which, I mean, it couldn't be more wonderful than that, right? But if you read it, and it's such a good declaration, but if you read those first two paragraphs, you can tell they're only thinking about science articles in the formulations. Mm-hmm.